Hi all, welcome to Cyber Warfare Labs AWS Cloud Red Team course. In this module, we will discuss about how we can access the credential which is stored there in AWS Lambda function. AWS Lambda function help us to like, retrieve a more credential which is there, so we can use those credentials to further perform red team operations. So credential access is one of the phase in red teaming activity where we gather a more credentials so we can use those credentials in our future red teaming or to access any other services. So you can see here in this diagram we have a lambda function. So suppose this is the lambda functions we have. In this lambda function, what we have a code. It depends what programming language we are using. So we have a code, a source code of the application. We have a library or dependencies. So there may be chance that you stored or developer stored the credential in one of the code. So you can retrieve the credential from the code. Second thing, each and every lambda function have environment variables, and this is high chance that you can get the credential from the environment variable. So basically, suppose if this lambda function is trying to connect to RDS services or in database services, there may be chance that you can store the credential in environment variables like username, password, host name, as well as port. So and it will also allow you a multiple way to retrieve these credentials. So let's see, you can see here we have a three ways currently. One is, if there is a RC there in one of the function, you can invoke this function and you can retrieve the credential from the OS operating system environment variable. This is the first thing. Second thing, you can use SSRF to call to the internal IPs or runtime environment. So basically internal IPs, you can get the event and the credential which is there in the particular events, as well as you can also retrieve the credential from the runtime environment. So it's depend if they have the credential or not. Third one is, if you have a CLI access, that means if you already gain the initial access, you can use CLI to retrieve the environment variable. So basically in Lambda functions, high chance that the credential will be there in the code as well as environment variables. But there is a multiple way to access this environment variable. So we'll see practically how we can exfiltrate the credentials which is there in environment variable with help of AWS Lambda functions. So first thing what we are going to do, we are going to retrieve the credentials from the OS environment variable that we already discussed how we get the initial access. So same like we can exfiltrate the credentials which is belongs to this particular Lambda function using remote code executions from the operating system environment variable. Let's copy this one and paste it here. So this is basically API gateway endpoint, and we will retrieve this thing. So you can see we already retrieved these AWS X6 access key ID, session token, as well as secret. So this is the one way we can retrieve the credential, and this is stored there in environment variable of particular operating system or containers where this Lambda function is executed. And this environment variable is basically belongs to this particular Lambda functions. So key you can see here is belongs to this particular Lambda functions. This is the one way you can get or you can retrieve the credentials. Now second thing, how you can get the credential or how you can access the credential. So suppose there is one Lambda function which we found there is a SSRF. So suppose this is the API which is mapped to one Lambda function, or which is basically invoked to one particular Lambda function, and we found there is SSRFs, server side request forgery. So you can call this endpoint and you can get the event data using this internal IP. So this is an internal API, and you can call this API to get the data if there is data which is, or event data if it is associated with this particular Lambda functions. So let's copy this one, let's paste it here. Let's see, can we get the more information? So you can see here it will give you the resource name, path, methods. So basically it will give you the HTTP methods, and which is really important if you have a API key or any authorization token, you can retrieve this thing from there. Or if you configure your events such like that, there is some sensitive information there, and if you found SSRF, there is a way you can get that credential from there. You can use this credential to further access the AWS services. So this is the second method we can use. Second thing is, this is a method we are using internal API. Now we can also use the environment variable. This is basically a operating system. If we found there is a SSRF, so we can read this file and we can retrieve the credential from there also. So it's basically depend what you have. If you have RC, you can get environment variable directly from the environment variable command executions. If you have a SSRF, or if you are able to retrieve the file from there, you can basically access this URL. So let's see, can we able to do that? So this is the one way you can get the environment related information from these functions. So this is really important, what we have, how we can access it. So we discussed that if you have RC, you can get the environment variable using environment command executions. If you have a SSRF, you can hit the internal APIs. And if you have a file read permissions or SSRF itself, you can retrieve the file, which is which is basically runtime environment file. So this is the method we can get. And third one is, suppose there may be a scenario in red team operations that you already got the initial access, but you need more credentials. Suppose you don't know how we connect to the RDS, but this Lambda function is basically used to connect to this RDS, and there is no role is attached to this Lambda function, but there is a credentials there in environment variable of this Lambda functions. So you can see all the two methods we use. We retrieve the credential or environment variable from the operating system basis, but in last one we are going to exfiltrate or access the credential which is directly there in environment variable of this Lambda function itself. So Lambda function have this environment variable sections. You can retrieve the credential from there, and this credential is basically used to authenticate to RDS database. So let's see how we can do that. So suppose in this scenario, we already assume that you already have access, because credential access is the phase which comes after initial access. So suppose you need to have the initial access to get the more credentials. So what we are going to do, first we are just open the AWS CLI command prompt. We already configured my the initial access key. Now let's see what we are going to do. We are going to do all the function which is there in this particular AWS account. So you can see there is one function, there is two functions, and there is three functions. So there are three functions. There are three functions which is there in AWS account. Okay, so now let's see, can we get the more information? So can we get the environment variable which is basically mapped to this or which is basically belongs to this Lambda functions? Let's copy this command, paste it here, open a new tab, paste it here, and specify the function name. So first what we are going to do, let's copy this one. This is the function name. Let's see if there is any environment variable which is attached to these functions. So you can see here there are no environment variable which is belongs to this functions. Let's clear this one. Let's again check function 2. In this function also there is no environment variable which is attached to these functions. Let's clear this one. Let's see function 1. And yes, you can see this is the section for environment variables, and these are the credential, or these are the value which is mapped to this function. So this is there in environment variable, which is basically connect to the RDS functions. So this is how you can access the credentials with a different method. It's basically depend upon what situations or what problems you have, or what situations you have in your red team operations, and what is the method we can get the credential from there. So this is the third one. We can access the credential from a Lambda function itself. So other two method, basically we are going to exfiltrate, or we are going to retrieve the credential from operating system environment variable. This is the API. This is same like an, if we have a read access or file access, or if you have SSRF. But this one, if you already have, the permissions or to get the function, then you can specify the function name to get the environment variable. You can also see this thing in your when you are going to retrieve the list function operation. You can also see environment variable, you can see here. So these are the method you can get the initial access and credential access. Basically you can get the credential access to use other AWS services. So this is all about this video. Thank you so much for watching this video.